This is Danny Haiphong with the Left Lens, and I am coming to you today to answer question number 3 from a student at Pomona College. And I hope that this video will be helpful in your political education process, as well as all of you who may be tuning in. So let's get straight to the question, shall we? The first part of the question asks, given the fact that a major duty of the U.S. president is to be the leader of the U.S. military, do you think it's possible to have an anti-imperialist president? And if so, how? This question is pretty simple in my eyes. The answer is no. It is not possible to have an anti-imperialist president. And let me explain why. In the United States, the U.S. president is the commander-in-chief. And it is important to understand what the president is the commander-in-chief of. So if the United States is an imperialist society, meaning a society that is dominated by the rule of monopolies, the rule of banks, the rule of finance capital, those usurious institutions that primarily rely on the outright gambling of money as well as the accumulation of debt and other financial packaging in order to exploit not only the working class, but also a subsection of the capitalist class that relies on finance capital in order to erect its own institutions of profit, then the U.S. military is by and large an army, an armed body of the state, which protects the interests of finance capital. So in effect, a U.S. president could not be anti-imperialist in any way, shape, or form. And we've seen this throughout the course of United States history. From the very beginning, people like Thomas Jefferson believed that the U.S. was going to be an empire of liberty, meaning that the U.S. would indeed spread its tentacles around the globe, but in the interests of so-called liberty and freedom and other so-called values that makes the United States exceptional. What a lot of U.S. presidents refuse to acknowledge, and would never do so in public, is that the U.S. military and its so-called empire of liberty is really protecting the riches of those who control society in the United States, and now, given that imperialism is a world economy, much of the world. In any event, we can really see what a U.S. president is all about by understanding how, regardless of political party changes in Washington, whether a Democrat or a Republican is elected president, and regardless of the political moment, for example, COVID-19, the crisis that's occurring right now, we see the United States not only ramping up sanctions and active war on nations like Iran and Venezuela, but we also see the United States' military actually intercepting medical supplies being shipped from China to countries like Italy, Canada, and elsewhere. What this means is that the Trump administration is using the COVID-19 crisis to ramp up war with China, as well as war on much of the planet, even its so-called allies. That shows that U.S. presidents are in effect incapable of standing up to the war machine. In 2016, Donald Trump spoke a pretty big game. We probably all remember when Donald Trump said that he would scale back the U.S.'s military provocations toward Russia, as well as toward China in some respects. But he also spoke the language of war toward Iran and Venezuela. And what this meant was that the Trump administration was never going to be an anti-war presidency. It was going to be selective in which wars it felt was a priority for those that they served, the section of the capitalist class that they served. Under the Obama administration, Democratic administration, the United States shifted 50% plus of the military's resources to surround China in what is called the pivot to Asia, and that policy has not ended. The Obama administration dropped more drones than the Bush administration on peoples of the Middle East and people all over the world, and even killed 2 U.S. citizens in Yemen. the military budget has grown under every single presidential administration to date, and in this pattern of growth has been most stark, starting with the George W. Bush Jr. administration into the Trump administration. And there has been no protest from any political party or president on this matter. So in effect, no, there cannot be an anti-imperialist president, and the actions of the presidency and the commander-in-chief should give us a good picture as to why. The second part of this question asks, what do you think the U.S. imperial landscape will look like 20 years from now, 100 years from now? Given the current state of the country, do you see an end to U.S. imperialism? And if so, what would that look like? This is a very complicated question. I will say that in 20 years from now, in 100 years from now, it does seem like U.S. imperialism's decline, as it is currently undergoing right now, will continue. Whether that means an end to U.S. imperialism remains to be seen. I don't think that there is an ability to predict this per se, but what I do know is that China to the east, and Russia as well, and all of the allies of these countries that are seeking an independent alternative to imperialism will continue to grow in strength. China's share of the global economy as a socialist nation will continue to threaten U.S. imperialism's grip on the political economy of the world. And that is not going to change. However, there will be monumental events, sort of like what's happening right now in the COVID-19 pandemic, which will speed up the process of imperial decline, as well as speed up the process of what will come next. Now, it's not certain what will come next. We know around the world that there is both a left-wing trend of the anti-imperialist movement, and we know that there's also a right-wing trend in response to the conditions of neoliberalism and imperialism around the world. That mainly resides in Europe, the right-wing trend, and the left-wing trend mainly resides in the global south, the poorer countries of the world. I think that, in 100 years, it's pretty certain that U.S. imperialism will not be the singular dominant model around the world, and it may not be dominant anymore. However, U.S. imperialism does have the power to annihilate entire countries, entire regions of the world, with a stroke of a pen. So I think it's important to understand that U.S. imperialism will fight to the death to survive. I truly do believe that. There is right now a doctrine in the Pentagon called Great Power Confrontation, which is the national security strategy of the United States, meaning that Russia and China represent the greatest threats to U.S. hegemony, and that the United States is preparing militarily and economically to fight those great powers. I don't think it will take 100 years for that conflict to come to a head. What I do think we need to do is think about how do we respond to crises like COVID-19 and how it exposes the U.S. war machine for all of its complete and utter horror that it spreads around the globe. But we also need to think about how do we prepare for when the United States inevitably, and it's happening right now, inevitably blames China and blames the great powers for problems that it in fact is spreading around the world. The economic catastrophe, the military and social catastrophes that we see, the utter poverty, the military occupations, the bombing campaigns, the sanctions, etc., etc. We can go on and on and on. I do not know what it will look like. What I hope it will look like is a new found struggle, especially in the imperialist West, in the United States as well, for socialism. Because what we are going to learn at the end of COVID-19, whenever the pandemic actually does subside in the imperialist West in the United States, is that China's alternative model of socialist construction is in fact far more desirable than what exists here in the United States, what exists in the Western world as a whole. That China has actually come to the rescue not only of poorer countries like Venezuela and African nations that have received so much aid from China in this time, but also Italy, France, Canada, and the United States, who desperately cannot even address this crisis without the critical aid that China has provided. So I hope that this pandemic, this crisis, will be just another step in the right direction, looking east and looking toward a new economic and social order that we need so desperately right now. The third part of this question asks, while reading Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, I was personally fascinated with how much the media historically contributed to public opinion about U.S. imperialism. How do you think the current prevalence of internet technology and social media benefits or harms our understanding and discussions about U.S. imperialism? Another really good question. I would say that internet technology and social media, all of this, it isn't apolitical, it isn't neutral, right? Technology is a means to an end. It is constant capital, as Marx would surmise. Basically, what that means is that technology is capital that actually has to either be produced or extracted, and how a society organizes production is, in effect, what determines how technology, social media, and the internet, for example, are used. And so right now, the internet and social media, for example, are considered public utilities in a lot of ways by many people, right? Billions of people are on Facebook. Billions of people are on the internet. However, these entities are mainly privately owned. They're owned by monopolies that have interests primarily in accumulating and maximizing their own profit margins. This inevitably means that the state is involved in protecting the profit margins, not only of these corporations, but of the ruling class as a whole. And so these institutions, these means of disseminating information, are actually heavily influenced by the state, and the state is all over them, right? Surveillance, the massive surveillance apparatus that the United States and its Western allies possess, is all over social media, collecting our data, surveilling us, and a lot of people get hopeless about it. What I would say is that we need to continue to use these tools to fight imperialist narratives, to make sure that we are reaching people, spreading anti-war propaganda and messages. However, we also have to be very realistic. We know that social media and a lot of the technology that is at our disposal is actually being wielded right now for the benefit of the ruling class and the imperialist system. And I do think that a lot of censorship happens. Actually, I know a lot of censorship happens because I've been targeted by it all over the internet. Algorithms are manipulated by Google, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, in order to suppress our content. And this has especially been intensified since the whole Russiagate fiasco, which began during the 2016 election, in order to basically place people like myself and other leftists in the same box as Trump supporters, alt-right, so-called alt-right figures, and folks who have a right-wing ideology, that we've all been clumped together as a sort of alt-left, alt-right alliance and suppressed all the same. So I think that's how the internet, technology, social media really harms our understanding and discussions about imperialism, that there is direct suppression and a privileging of corporate sources, right? So CNN, New York Times, sources that are directly connected to the Pentagon, to NATO, and to the biggest imperialist institutions don't face this kind of discrimination and suppression. They get free reign to spread their narratives, to sponsor their narratives, to advertise their narratives, and That's something that we don't have the ability to do. Us anti-imperialists in the struggle have to work even 10 times harder, 50 times harder, without the capital and without the ownership over this technology to really make sure that our content is getting out there. So this is a very multifaceted question, but I'll leave it at that. And the last part of this question asks, how do we even begin to dismantle the U.S. imperialist machine? Is there anything I can do as an individual? So we begin to dismantle the U.S. imperialist machine when we, one, learn what this machine is all about, how it's constructed, and what it's constructed to serve. So we need to make sure that we're continuing to conduct ongoing political education, that we don't stop after we read certain texts in a classroom, or whether we've come to these readings on our own. We need to continue to study and spread that study to other people. Study with others, get involved in organizations. If there are anti-war organizations in your area, join them or work with them. Begin to write. Begin to spread the message on social media. Make your own blogs. Submit to organizations and independent media that are friendly to this work, that will accept this work, because I am all too familiar with the fact that even on the left, anti-imperialism is not necessarily a priority. So I would say that as an individual, those are some things you can do. And how we begin to dismantle the machine as a whole is by building a grassroots movement that is able to connect the conditions here on the ground where we are in the United States, the poverty, the crisis of healthcare that we're seeing now with the COVID-19 pandemic, but even before that, the for-profit healthcare system, which literally kills tens of thousands needlessly because healthcare is not a human right in the United States. Climate change, connecting the fact that the U.S. military is the biggest polluter in the world, but that most of the environmental movement is not addressing that. Ensuring that the racist narratives that are used to demonize people abroad, to make them targets of war, to make sure that people in the United States do not fight back when the U.S. is bombing the people of Yemen, or the people of Iraq, or the people of Libya, or the people of Syria, or the people of Ukraine, or the people all across Northern Africa and Mali, and nations all over the world, that these racist narratives are connected to the racist narratives that are peddled right here in the United States to make certain groups targets of war. Black Americans, Native Americans, immigrant communities. These narratives are connected and they serve the same purpose, to justify exploitation and oppression. And we need to be able to connect them together, because if we're not fighting all injustice, then we're not really fighting any injustice. And I think that should be the lesson about imperialism, is that if we're leaving out the question of war and peace, then we're not really addressing even the problems that we think we are. Because if we're allowing the United States military to be funded at trillions of dollars, while basic needs for ordinary and poor and working class people here in the United States are going neglected, then we are not only in trouble, but we are also ensuring that people around the world cannot trust the left to come to their aid and to be in solidarity with them, and then we lose key potential allies in our own struggles for emancipation and liberation. Right now, if I were a leader strategically in a grassroots organization, I would be trying, and this is what I try to do all the time, trying to build solidarity with the people of China, build solidarity with the people of Cuba, build solidarity with the people of Venezuela, build solidarity with all the countries that are effectively addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, so we can build lasting relationships when inevitably we will be faced with our own crises outside of the pandemic that require a worldwide movement for social justice and socialism to really address. We're not going to address mass incarceration as a pure domestic issue, fighting it as a single issue. We're not going to address police brutality as a single issue. we're not going to address economic exploitation, the impoverishment of the working class as a single issue. I think what COVID-19, as well as just the ongoing onslaught of U.S. imperialism is showing us, is that we can't address any issue as a single issue. And I hope that, as we move forward and begin to learn from this crisis and the crises to come, that we begin to spread that message across the United States and begin to build those ties of solidarity so we can isolate what Mao called the paper tiger of U.S. imperialism. With that said, I'm going to end here, and I just want to thank this Pomona College student for asking these questions to me, and I hope that this helps all of your political education processes as we move forward in this time of social distancing, quarantine, etc. This is Danny Haiphong, and you've listened to The Left Lens. Good night.